The Rambam tells us in mitzvah number 14 that we have a mitzvah of asu lehem tzitzis, to make the mitzvah of tzitzis, and you shall put on this tzitzis, on these strings, you shall also put a pesil techeles, some blue wool as well. What is the pshat and remez and drush and soid and chassidus of this mitzvah? If you look into the prayer that we recite every day, the 3rd chapter of the Shema, it says over there that you have a mitzvah of putting on tzitzis, and by putting on the tzitzis, through this, you will remember all the mitzvahs of God. And Rashi goes on to say, what is the meaning of the word tzitzis? So Rashi says the word tzitzis has 2 interpretations. Number 1, pesilim, which means strings. And this is based on a verse in Ezekiel chapter 8. V'kacheni b'tzitzis roishi, and you'll grab me by the hairs of my head. And therefore the strings represent these strings of the tzitzis. The second reason why it's called tzitzis, says Rashi, is from a verse in the Song of Songs known as Meitzis min hacharakim. It says over there that God peers through the windows and he peers through the cracks, and therefore the word tzitzis means to look, to gaze. And the mitzvah of tzitzis is to gaze on these strings and to remember all the 613 commandments of the Torah. How does one remember all the 613 commandments of the Torah? By gazing and looking on the tzitzis. So here Rashi continues by saying that the word tzitzis is spelled tzadik yud and a saf. Tzadik is 90, Yud is 10, Tzadik is 90, Yud is 10, and a Saf is 400. So you have the number 600. And then you have 8 strings and 5 knots, which equals 613. So by looking at the tzitzis, you will therefore remember all of the mitzvahs of God. When it comes to wearing a pair of tzitzis, there are 2 types of tzitzis. There is the tallit katan and the tallit gadol. There is the big tallit that we put over our clothing, that we wear during prayer. And then there is the tallit katan, the small tallit that we wear under our clothing. And we have our strings sticking out. We will talk about this soon. So what is the difference between the tallit gadol and the tallit katan? Why do we need 2 sets of tzitzis? Why isn't one enough? Also, the concept of the blue wool, we find that Rashi tells us, comes from a certain animal or a fish or a snail called the chalazon. Many say it's found in the Mediterranean, and there are those today in Israel who have a factory where they produce the dye for the blue wool in the tzitzis. However, to set the record straight, according to Chabad, the Rebbe has stated that according to the Rebbe Rashab, that until the coming of Mashiach, we do not have the blue wool. And therefore it's possible that people have found it, and they bring proofs to this discovery, and you want to wear it, it's a wonderful thing. However, as the Rambam himself says, that Hatcheles eina makeves as a lavan, if you don't have the blue wool in the tzitzis, you can still fulfill the mitzvah of the wearing of the tzitzis. And therefore, nada pashta, there are many different approaches. If you want to wear the blue wool, is tovei lav bracha, you should have blessing, and God should bless you for doing the mitzvah. But I, as a Lubavitcher Chassid, follow my Rebbe, and he says that until the coming of Mashiach, we don't have the blue wool. So this is the pshat. What is the remez? What is the hint? How does this connect with the coming of Mashiach? So we know that in the davening every day, before the Shema, we say, V'avienu l'shalom, me'arba kanfei haaretz, that God will bring us to peace from all the 4 corners of the world. In other words, God will gather all of his children, the Jewish people, from all the four corners of the world. And the minhag is, the custom is, when we say these words, we take the four corners of our tzitzis, of our tallis, and we put it together, and we put it between our two fingers, our pinky, and then we bring it up between the ring finger and the middle finger, or the first finger and the second finger. So this concept is connected to the tzitzis, because really what God is going to do by we gathering our four corners of the tzitzis, this will cause God to gather the four corners of the world and bring his children back to the Holy Land. Furthermore, we stated earlier that Rashi says that the word tzitzis comes from the word meitzis min hacharakim, and as the Metzudas David explains, that this represents how God is ready and prepared to bring back his Shekhinah, his divine presence, to the Jewish people and to hasten the redemption. And furthermore, it is as if already Mashiach is here, because God is looking through the windows. In other words, we have the ability to see God and to see redemption and see the Mashiach peeking in to us, even though we're still in exile, knowing that momentarily the redemption will take place. So the concept of when you take your tzitzis and you look at the tzitzis to remind yourself of the Geula, that the redemption is very, very near, and God is ready to take us out of Golus. This is the Remez. What is the Drush? What is the homiletics? So we find over here an argument between the Mechaber. The Mechaber is Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and the Magen Avraham, how one is supposed to wear his small tzitzis. According to the Mechaber, who is the rabbi for the Sfardim, the Mechaber says you're supposed to wear the talis katan. You're supposed to wear even the small pair of tzitzis on top of your garments, so that you will see them all the time, and it will constantly remind you of the mitzvos of God. But if you put it inside your shirt, you put it inside your pants, you're not going to see it. That's the opinion of the Mechaber. The Magen Avraham brings down the opinion of the Arizal. And Arizal says that the talis katan, the small talis, is put underneath all of your garments. And even the strings are put under your garments, and you're not supposed to see it. Now, even though we put it under all your garments out of respect and honor to the tzitzis, you don't put it directly on your skin. You put an undershirt between the tzitzis and your body, but basically the tzitzis should be under all your garments. However, the Magen Avraham goes on to conclude that in truth the way we should do it is that the main garment of the tzitzis should be under your clothing, but the strings of your tzitzis should be out. And that is the same way the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shnei Zalman of Liadi, concludes and concurs in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, and that is that the strings of the tzitzis should be hanging outward. Now the Rebbe explains this argument, and he says basically that there's a question pertaining to the mitzvah of tzitzis. Do we say that the aspect of Uri'isem oiseyu zachartem, I will look at the tzitzis and remember all the mitzvos, is that part and parcel of the actual mitzvah of tzitzis, or is it secondary? In other words, you have the mitzvah of putting on tzitzis, And in addition to that, you also have the side effect. And the advantage by wearing the mitzvah of tzitzis, this will remind you of all the other mitzvahs. And therefore the Mechaber, who says you have to wear the tzitzis outside, his opinion is that the mitzvah of tzitzis is to remind us of all the mitzvahs. And that is part and parcel of the mitzvah. And that is essential to the mitzvah. And therefore, in order for one to be able to fulfill the mitzvah, you have to be looking at your tzitzis all the time. And therefore, the garment of the tzitzis and the string of the tzitzis should be on top of all your garments. According to the Magen Avraham and the opinion of the Arizal, the mitzvah of tzitzis is simply to have a garment with 4 strings, which are doubled over into 8 strings, which is a total of 32 strings. That's the mitzvah. In addition to that, there's also a concept, you shall look at them and remember them. And therefore, primarily, this mitzvah is fulfilled by wearing the big tzitzis during the davening in the morning that you wear on top of all your clothing. But the tzitzis that go underneath, that is for a second purpose. So what is the difference, Taka? Why then do we need 2 pairs of tzitzis? Why do we need a pair of tzitzis on the outside and a pair of tzitzis on the inside? And the Rebbe goes on to explain that there are 2 levels of Uri Isam Oisei. There are 2 levels pertaining to looking at the tzitzis. One is simply, I will look at the tzitzis, and this will help me overcome any temptation. If I want to do something bad, I'll look at the tzitzis, and I will know, don't do anything bad. The tzitzis remind me of all the mitzvahs. Furthermore, when I need to do something good, again, the tzitzis will be there as a reminder that I should do the proper thing. It's like having the ring of your master constantly on your finger, reminding you who you are and to whom you belong, and what is your obligation. So that is the reason that we wear the tzitzis, the talis, on the outside. What is the reason why we wear the tzitzis on the inside? So according to the Arizal, the reason of wearing the tzitzis on the inside is because of pnimius, which means a deeper and a inner purpose of doing the mitzvahs. It's not about looking at the tzitzis to remind me simply not to sin or to do a good deed. That already I have fulfilled by wearing the outer tzitzis. By wearing the inner tzitzis, this reminds me of the inner purpose, of the deeper reason of why I do a mitzvah, and that is to connect with God. And this also reminds me to introspect, am I doing the mitzvah for the right reason? Do I do the mitzvah for arrogance, to have public acclaim, that others should say, wow, look how great he is? Or do I wear the mitzvah and do the mitzvah because this is God's command, and therefore on a deeper, inner way, I am connecting with God in a more altruistic and wholesome manner. So according to the Arizal, the outside tzitzis represent the practical application of the mitzvah, and the inside tzitzis represent the deeper meaning behind the mitzvah. And therefore the Rebbe concludes that nowadays, being that we are living in a world that we have many temptations, and there are many, many difficulties and challenges, and not everybody is on the level of that Arizal, to wear the tzitzis on the inside, to simply do the mitzvah for the only inner purpose and the inner reason, simply to connect to God. So therefore, in addition to wearing the tzitzis under the garments, to follow the approach of the Arizal, we also wear the strings outside the garments, so that we have a remembrance on a very external level to practically refrain from doing evil and to be encouraged to do the positive mitzvah. So this is the drush, the homiletics, or the halacha of the mitzvah. What is the soid? What is the esoteric level? The esoteric level is that Arizal writes, or rather his disciple Rab Chaim Vital writes, that the Arizal would wear his tzitzis day and night. Even though it says in the Torah, Uri isam oisei, you shall see them. And therefore, at night you don't see tzitzis. In other words, at night is not a time of seeing. And therefore one does not have the obligation to wear the tzitzis at night, which is also the reason why women don't have the obligation of putting on tzitzis, because it's a mitzvah that has a specific time zone, and women are only obligated to do mitzvahs that are universal and that are constant. But a mitzvah that is limited and confined and regulated to a specific time, women do not have the obligation to keep. So therefore, technically, according to the Torah and according to halacha, one is not obligated to wear tzitzis during the night. However, Rab Chaim Vital testifies that the Arizal wore the tzitzis during the day and during the night, and he goes on to say, tzarich, that a person has to sleep with the tzitzis even in his bed. And one should never take off his tzitzis. Because even though at night we don't fulfill the mitzvah of Uri Isa Moisei to see the tzitzis, because at night it's dark, so therefore we don't call it the talis godel, the large talis, we call it the small talis, because it has only the small aspect of tzitzis, not the big aspect of tzitzis, which is to see it. But the other advantages of tzitzis do apply also to the night. He goes on to say that the only time a person should really take off his tzitzis is when he takes a shower. That is the one time you should take off your tzitzis. And he brings a proof. How do we know this? We know this from the famous story of King David. That King David was once in the bathhouse. And he took off his tzitzis and his tefillin and his yarmulke. And he said, woe to me that I am naked in mitzvahs. And the Gemara goes on to conclude, he reminded himself that he was circumcised, he wasn't so upset. But the Arizal points out from this Gemara that the only time he took off his tzitzis was not when he went to sleep, rather it was only in the bathhouse. So here we see that King David himself also wore the tzitzis when he went to sleep at night. And the Arizal goes on to say that if you add up the loops that we make around the tzitzis, you will count the loops. We have 7 and 8 and 11 and 13. It equals the number 39. And 39 is the same gematria as Hashem Echad, God is one. God is 26, and Echad is 13. So 26 and 13 is 39. And those are the amount of krichos, the amount of circles or windings and loops that we make around the strings of the tzitzis. We also find that the Sefer HaChinuch writes that the 7 loops that we make around the beginning of the tzitzis and the 13 that we make at the end allude to the 7 heavens. We know that the Gemara says there are 7 heavens, and each heaven has also a road between one heaven and the other. So you have 7 heavens, and the roads in between are 6. So 7 and 6 are 13. And this is consistent with the Talmud, that the Talmud says the least amount of loops you should make is 7, and the most is 13, alluding to the 7 heavens, including the highways in between one and the other. And this is connected with the techeles, the blue wool that one should put on the tzitzis. What is the reason one puts blue wool on the tzitzis? The Gemara says simply, when you will look at the blue wool, it will remind you of the blue sea, which will remind you of the blue skies, which will remind you of God who sits high in the sky. And therefore, those who don't have the blue wool today, by looking at the 7 loops and the 13 loops, again you will fulfill this opportunity and this objective of bringing upon the yoke of God upon you, who rests and sits in his throne in the sky. And that is why, as the Arizal says, there are 39 loops altogether, alluding to Hashem Echad, God is one, because when you put on the tallit around you, you have to have in mind that you're accepting the yoke of God upon you unconditionally. So this is the soid, this is the esoteric level of the mitzvah of tzitzis. What does Chassidus say? In addition to the insights that the Rebbe gave on tzitzis, perhaps we can ask the following question, and that is, if you look into the code of Jewish law, you will see that the mitzvah of tzitzis is not an obligation. Tefillin is an obligation. Shabbos is an obligation. A mezuzah even is an obligation if you have a house. But tzitzis is not something you have to wear. Tzitzis is only if you have a four-cornered garment. Then you have to put onto the four-cornered garment these strings of the tzitzis. But one does not have to run after this mitzvah. To fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, like one has to run after tefillin to put on tefillin. So the question that Rebbe asks is, why is it so? We just explained how important tzitzis is. You should wear it during the day, and you should wear it at night. And furthermore, the mitzvah of tzitzis is equivalent to all the other mitzvahs. By looking at the mitzvah, it's going to remind you of all the 613 commandments of the Torah. And therefore it's so fundamental. It's a yesoid, it's a foundation and a pillar in the Torah. And yet, we are told you don't have the obligation to put on tzitzis. So the Rebbe answers this question by saying that we find that the mitzvah of tzitzis is found in the portion of Shalach, which is the portion of the spies. When it came to send the spies, God told Moshe, Shalach l'cha l'daitecha. You, Moshe, should send the spies based on your own knowledge. In other words, I will not command you to do so. But think about it on your own. We have a mitzvah in the Torah, uvacharta b'chayim, you shall choose life. God says, I will put before you good and evil. But you have the mitzvah to choose. And therefore, when it comes to the mitzvah of tzitzis, this is not a mitzvah that God wants to force you to do. But rather, God says if you will think about it, if you will meditate on the mitzvah, if you will focus on the strings of the mitzvah, and you will realize how important the mitzvah is, you will come to the realization that this mitzvah is something that I must do. And therefore it's going to be even a greater mitzvah, because you will have a deeper and more meaningful connection with the mitzvah. Why do you put on the tzitzis? Not because I am forcing you. Why are you putting on the tzitzis? Not because I am commanding you. Why are you putting on the tzitzis? Not because I am making you do this, but rather I want to do this. I thought about it, I realized the importance of it, and that is why I want to wear the tzitzis. There's a story told, and I don't want to confuse the story with the facts, but the basic story is that there was a businessman that once came to the Rebbe, and he was telling the Rebbe he does business in the Far East, and he was asking the Rebbe advice. In the middle of the conversation, the Rebbe changes the whole concept, and he says, by the way, do you know why the tzitzis has 32 strings? Each corner has 8, and then 8, and 8, and 8, 8, 16, 32. Do you know why the tzitzis is made up of 32 strings? And the man said, no. The Rebbe said 32 is the gematria for the word heart. Lev is 32. And therefore the Rebbe concluded, by wearing tzitzis at night, this will protect your heart. Now, he had no idea why the Rebbe told him this. He was talking about business in the Far East, and the Rebbe talks about tzitzis. He says, thank you, Rebbe, but let's get back to business. In the interim, Years passed, and the individual continued to do business in the Far East, going back and forth from America, from the USA to the Far East. And many years later, in the Far East, standing in the airport on the way back to New York, he collapsed in the airport with a heart attack. They brought him to the hospital there, and from the hospital they phoned to the Rebbe's office in 770 Eastern Parkway, and they told the Rebbe that this fellow is in the hospital, he had a heart attack. And the Rebbe responded, "Is he wearing tzitzis at night? Find out if the gentleman is putting on tzitzis at night. If he does, it will protect him." So we see here that the tzitzis has many, many blessings, many advantages. In addition to the fact that by looking at them, this will remind me of all the 613 commandments of the Torah. At the same time, it also has personal health value. It has a very good side effect and personal benefits. And that is, by wearing the tzitzis, we will truly be protected, not only spiritually, but also physically. So we hope and pray that by putting on the tzitzis, Uzachartem is called Mitzvah Hashem, this will cause us to do more mitzvos, and V'avienu, and God will take us from the four corners of the world, Mi'arba Kanfes Haaretz, and to bring us back to the land of Israel with the rebuilding of the third holy temple speedily in our days.